is a hardwood market report update. So this time I'd like to introduce Andy Johnson. Andy has spoken at our meetings before, and he's got over 20 years of experience analyzing and reporting on North American markets, and he's also the assistant editor of the Hardwood Market Report. So Andy, welcome to our virtual annual meeting. And again, folks, if you have any questions for Andy, please put those in the question and answer bar at the bottom of your screen. And as we have time at the end, we'll take on some questions. So Andy, I'll turn it over to you. And Andy, you might still be muted.
How about now? We
Yep,
good now?
There you go.
We can sorry about that.
See your slides. You're good
sorry.
To go.
Good deal. Well, good afternoon, everyone, and thanks for attending my presentation and for attending the OFA virtual meeting. Sounds like it's gone pretty good so far. Today, it is my privilege to offer HMR's perspective on market conditions and the factors that are driving business now and also into the future. Last year, of course, I don't need to say, but I will anyways, was a tumultuous year for our country and, of course, obviously for our industry. Unfortunately, many of last year's circumstances carried over into 2021. When we talk to people, we still hear about a lot of uncertainty about what lies ahead. Hopefully, my talk will provide at least some clarity about where we stand as an industry and where we are going in these uncertain times. I'd like to start, as I usually do, by looking at the big picture, the economy. Coronavirus containment measures, as we all know, brought the U.S. economy to its knees last year, especially the unprecedented slump in the second quarter. As expected, economic activity rebounded strongly in the third quarter as restrictions were eased across much of the country. You're going to see similar things in a lot of our slides about production, about consumption, about demand that show, a huge drop-off followed by a significant recovery, some of which was probably pent-up demand or pent-up production, but some of which I believe is actually a net increase in demand independent of the COVID situation. At this point, certain sectors of the economy and certain sections of the country are performing at pre-COVID levels, if not better, but many sectors continue to suffer from the ongoing pandemic. This partial recovery is evident when looking at employment trends. Non-farm employment reached an all-time high of 153 million people at the end of 2019. As we all know, once lockdowns began, millions of people were laid off or let go. By April, 22 million fewer people were employed than just 5 months earlier. As of this January, less than half of those job losses had been restored. Employment is still 12 million below the November 2019 peak. One problem is that government measures intended to provide short-term relief are now disincentivizing work. That is one reason why businesses throughout the hardwood supply chain are struggling to find employees, even though tens of millions of people are unemployed. I'm not going to go down the rabbit trail of trying to hire and retain employees, but I think it's well recognized by almost everyone everywhere in our industry that that's a problem. And it's actually limiting production and to some extent limiting demand. Despite everything that's happened, though, key sectors that drive domestic hardwood demand are performing very well. The housing industry is the poster child for this. In 2020, total new home starts climbed 7% and single family starts were up an even more impressive 12%. This is amazing with the global pandemic, higher unemployment, and shortages of many building materials. The numbers probably could have been even quite a bit better. In fact, starts were the highest in 13 to 14 years, and they were more than double 10 years before. But they were still not quite back to the 50-year averages for total and single family starts as shown with these lines that go across the screen. Now let's look at monthly starts in 2020 and January 2021 to see more recent trends. Starts have risen sharply since May and were well above those long-term averages I just mentioned each of the last 4 reporting months, so October through January. In fact, the single family start rate in December of 1.23 million units was the highest since September of 2006. The US now has a chronic shortage of single-family homes, which is one reason for these good results. Of course, it doesn't hurt that mortgage rates are now in the 2 to 3% range. At this point, home building is constrained more by labor and raw material supplies, at least it seems to us, than it is by demand. There is every reason to expect continued vibrant growth in home building, with labor and raw material supplies probably putting a ceiling on production more so than demand. The good news doesn't end there, though. This is probably even more important than home building. Home remodeling is one of the primary drivers of hardwood demand. Updated kitchens and bathrooms and new floors are among the most popular remodeling projects. Plus, homeowners almost always buy new furniture after they remodel rooms. So it is encouraging that spending on home repairs and remodeling soared 20% last year to $220 billion, shattering previous records. Results were especially impressive the last 5 months of the year, consistently exceeding $230 billion on an annualized basis. The home is increasingly viewed as a haven from the world, and it's now the primary workplace for millions more of us Americans than in the past. And of course, when new home supplies are low, homeowners upgrade their existing homes more often. So given low home supplies and people spending extensive time in their homes, the outlook for remodeling remains very good. While home building and remodeling are rapidly expanding, that is not the case for non-residential construction. Commercial, office, and lodging construction are the three non-residential sectors that use the most wood products: millwork, flooring, furniture, and so on. Combined spending in these sectors hit $182 billion in 2019, which was a record. However, spending fell for the first time in 9 years last year. It fell by 3%. In early 2020, building was on par with the record levels seen in 2019, but as COVID closed more and more businesses, activity slowed. Obviously, if you're closing restaurants, you're not likely to expand and build new ones, and the same goes for all kinds of other buildings. At this point, many restaurants, retail stores, hotels, and conference centers remain closed even now, or they're still subject to restrictions on customer occupancy. Some of them are barely hanging on. Sadly, many more will fail in the months ahead, and commercial vacancy rates will keep rising. Until that situation changes and COVID is well controlled and people are traveling again, non-residential construction will continue to slow. So we believe this will be a net drag on hardwood demand, but much less of a concern because housing and remodeling are so strong. Now I'd like to look at the individual market sectors, major market sectors in the US for hardwoods, and see how they're performing. Manufacturer shipments of residential solid wood flooring did fall 5% last year, and that was on the heels of a 6% decline the year before. Losses of market share to engineered wood and non-wood products like LVT and ceramic tile have been problematic for the flooring industry, as I think we all know. We are somewhat encouraged, or I am somewhat encouraged, because the decrease in 2020 was smaller than the decrease in 2019. And we did have a pandemic. We did have all kinds of issues with manufacturers unable to increase their production and shipments toward the end of the year. So it's quite possible the results would have been much better without that situation. We really won't know until we get further into this year, but we're encouraged. With each of these sectors, I'm just going to show you where imports are trending as well. U.S. imports of solid wood flooring more than tripled from 2010 through 2019. You don't see the earlier years on this graph, but they more than tripled. But in 2019, that growth slowed to 4%, and then imports actually plunged 20% last year. There are many reasons for this decline in flooring imports. Obviously, COVID is probably one of them. But tariffs on Chinese flooring are the primary reason why we saw that big drop off. This chart shows for 2019, 2020, and the first 2 months of 2021, monthly shipments from U.S. Residential flooring manufacturers. Even though manufacturer shipments slid last year, the latest monthly results, I think, offer some encouragement going forward. Shipments each of the last 6 months were above the same months 1 year earlier, and in many cases, they were much higher. Total shipments during that 6-month period were up 11% year over year. Some of this growth was probably pent-up demand being released that had been built up during the severe lockdown period, but from everything we can tell, it appears business is gaining traction apart from that, kind of paralleling home building and remodeling activity. Same is true for the cabinet business. Cabinet sales for manufacturers that report to KCMA increased 2% last year to a 13-year high of $7.5 billion. It was the 9th consecutive year of expansion. Growth rate of 2% may not seem very impressive at first glance, but it is impressive given the massive year-over-year declines in April and May sales. Sales steadily gained momentum in the second half of 2020, showing large gains over the same months in 2019. The outlook for business in 2021 and beyond appears bright given robust home building and especially record remodeling activity. Imports of wood cabinets climbed sharply through 2018 to reach $1.8 billion. That was almost quadruple the 2010 total. In 2019, imports fell 24%, which was entirely due to U.S. tariffs and anti-dumping duties on Chinese cabinets. As it typically does, production has just since shifted to other countries. 2 examples, the 2 leading cabinet suppliers to the U.S. now are Vietnam and Malaysia. What's happened over the last 2 years for those? Well, cabinet imports from Vietnam climbed from $6 million in 2018 to $50 million in 2019, and then to $385 million last year. Likewise, imports from Malaysia rose from $132,000 worth of cabinets in 2018 to $50 million in 2019, and then $349 million last year. Like flooring and cabinets, shipments from residential furniture factories fell dramatically in April, remained low in May, and then did recover later in the year. For the whole year, shipments fell 6%. Factories have seen a surge in orders since the middle of last year and are struggling to keep up due to limited labor supplies and, in certain cases, raw material shortages. Now, this includes wood furniture factories and upholstered furniture factories. But at this point, because they have not been able to keep up, order backlogs have grown exponentially and are now extremely high. At the same time, U.S. imports of wood furniture edged up 2% in 2020. This market seems to be not flat, but it seems that we've kind of reached a saturation point. Wood furniture has massive market share, but the domestic side is growing too. Regardless of the import growth, I expect domestic wood furniture companies to see noticeable benefit from the ongoing gains in home building and remodeling. And of course, Ohio has one of the largest wood furniture areas in the country. Now we're going to turn to the amount of grade lumber consumption by each of the 4 major domestic markets. The blue columns show our final estimates of consumption by those markets for 2020. The black and white columns immediately to the left of those are our mid-year estimates, which we made during the height of the pandemic containment measures. And not surprisingly, the mid-year estimates showed big declines, 22% to as much as 41% compared to 2019. But for each sector, there was strong rallies in the second half, and the final numbers for 2020 were well above our mid-year estimates. So we at least trended back up and in a positive direction. Still, domestic consumption of grade lumber fell 12% for the year to just under 1.9 billion board feet. Consumption by the pallet sector declined 14% in 2020, and tie industry consumption slid 5%. As with all grade lumber markets, year-end consumption estimates for these 2 sectors were well above the mid-year estimates. Once economic growth turned positive in the 3rd quarter, demand for pallets recovered and has been rising ever since. Last year, sawmills did increase tie production, at least for a while, because other markets were weak and not taking material, and Thai markets still were taking because they were still trying to rebuild their inventories. Some treaters did reach inventory objectives, and then they did slow their purchases, but overall Thai demand remained decent and is still decent today. The board road and crane mat sector, of course, is a whole nother matter. Weak economic activity and depressed oil prices greatly reduced exploration and new drilling. And activity continued to fall off the second half of the year, and certainly has not improved with some of the things that have happened since the election and with the Biden administration, with the Keystone Pipeline and other measures. Let's take a look at exports. As we all know, exports to China fluctuated a lot the last several years. Shipments hit an all-time high in 2017, then fell about 50% the next 2 years. In January of 2020, exports to China were relatively good, 47 million board feet. But shipments plunged in February and March amid widespread COVID lockdowns at Chinese factories, at Chinese ports, basically throughout China. Chinese yards and end users, once things got back running again, they replenished their inventories in the second quarter, where we see this big jump here in shipments. But then they moderated their purchases in the third quarter, and that was partly because they had refilled their shelves and also because lumber prices were climbing and they were resisting those increases. That price resistance did begin to fade late in the year, and purchasing picked up. All told, exports to China rose 2% for the year. Not a bad performance. The next 4 slides on exports show similar quarterly trends for several markets in 2020. That is decent first quarter business, dramatic declines in the second quarter, and recovery in the second half of the year. That was certainly the pattern for Vietnam, but when the year was done, exports had risen 2% to set a record for the 4th straight year. And importantly, Vietnam surpassed Canada as the second largest foreign market for U.S. hardwood lumber. The quarterly pattern also held true for Canada. Again, second quarter results were poor, with improvement in each subsequent quarter. However, third and fourth quarter shipments were still well below past norms. Total exports to Canada fell 19% last year, to the lowest level since 1986. In the first quarter of 2020, combined exports to the EU and UK were comparable to 2018 and 2019 levels for the first quarter. Shipments, though, tumbled in the second quarter and have not fully recovered. Total volume for the year was down 9% to a 35-year low of 126 million board feet. Shipments declined to 4 of the top 5 European markets. Spain was the lone bright spot with a 16% increase. Exports to Mexico in the first, third, and fourth quarters of 2020 were on par with 2019. However, second quarter shipments were off more than 50%, resulting in a net decline of 10% for the year. Mexican factories that make products for U.S. markets were relatively busy during the second half of the year as the U.S. Came back as an economy. But domestic demand in Mexico was weak amid a severe recession. Total U.S. exports of hardwood lumber were just over 1.3 billion board feet in 2020, which was a 5% decrease from the year before. However, positive trends after the easing of COVID restrictions suggest a favorable outlook going forward. One important indicator to me is the U.S. exported more lumber in the fourth quarter than any other quarter of 2020. That's only happened 3 times in the last 24 years. We don't have any data for January or February yet, but exporters are telling us shipments are good and limited more by supply than demand. Now, a very important matter, production. This is Eastern U.S. hardwood sawmill production on a monthly basis that we annualize and report here at HMR. As the coronavirus pandemic spread in the U.S. and around the world, of course, economic activity dropped off, and of course, so did hardwood demand. Supply inevitably adjusts to demand, and in 2020, that response was almost immediate. In the May through July period, production was almost 40% lower than during the first quarter of the year. Mills were not only responding to reduced demand at that time, but to uncertainty about the future. After all, we had never in our lifetimes been through this sort of thing. And also the potential for a COVID outbreak to halt their own operations, possibly resulting in logs and lumber being spoiled if they had to stop operating. Production has been slow to rebound for several reasons, including lack of capital, labor constraints, and reduced timber purchases during the height of the pandemic. For all of 2020, production fell 26% to 5.65 billion board feet, the lowest level in the 60 years HMR has been tracking production. This slide compares consumption with total supply of hardwood lumber in the US from all sources, domestic and imported. As you can see, supply typically overcorrects to demand, whether in up or down cycles. And that happened again in 2020. Supply declined much more than consumption, and inventories rapidly contracted the second half of the year. Most hardwood items are now in tight supply, as many of you know. In fact, many companies have been consistently oversold on key items for months despite continued price increases. While production has been slow to recover so far, it will inevitably recover just as it has following past event-driven downturns. I'll just turn back to the last slide for a minute. We see here the yellow lines. That shows when production came back after falling off during, for example, the terrorist attacks of 2001, the housing bust, the Great Recession. We don't know what that line is going to look like this go around, but we know there'll be an upturn, just a matter of time. Now, of course, a lot of people are saying, well, when will that be? The vast majority of our industry contacts, whether they're on the purchasing or sales side, do not expect supply and demand to reach equilibrium until late this year. For a while, it was thought that would happen this summer, and it may still happen this summer. But the growing sentiment is that it's going to take longer than that before we see production get to the point where it's meeting demand and prices start to stabilize. And obviously, we'll just have to wait and see. In the meantime, as we all know, prices have been jumping. Supplies are strained and demand is increasing, so prices jump. Almost across the board, prices are significantly higher now than a year ago. Prices for kiln-dried 2A and better red oak and 1 common and better white oak increased about 40% in the last 12 months. Poplar rose almost 30% and cherry was up about 35%. Just in the last 5 months, pallet can prices have climbed more than 20%. Now, I'm going to not try to depress you, but I do want to show a slide that I showed at last year's meeting because I think it's still relevant today. This graph indexes several key economic indicators to 2010 levels and does the same for domestic consumption of hardwood grade lumber. From 2010 through 2020, new single-family home starts more than doubled. Repair and remodeling spending climbed 92%, and US GDP increased by 40%. However, domestic consumption of grade lumber was only 6% higher in 2020 than in 2010. A more than doubling of housing, near doubling of remodeling, and hardwood usage climbed 6%. And of course, we all know why. Solid hardwood has steadily lost market share to composite wood products and to non-wood products. Among the perpetrators are concrete, tile, and LVT flooring, MDF and plastic molding, and cabinets made from all kinds of materials, even metal, but more often than not MDF. In this environmentally conscious age, we should be able to do well though, because unlike those wood products, or unlike our wood products, the raw materials used to make those products must be extracted from the ground and often heavily processed afterward. Unlike wood, most are not renewable, at least not for thousands of years or more, and most come with a much larger carbon footprint than wood. Awareness is growing among the public that wood is an environmentally friendly material, especially versus concrete, plastic, and steel. However, we will not recapture market share until a lot more consumers know these truths and act on them in their purchasing decisions. Looking at current circumstances, there are reasons to be concerned for our country and our industry. The pandemic is not over. The country is politically polarized. And the Biden administration is embracing all kinds of anti-business policies and in effect has majorities in both houses of Congress, so has a good chance of getting some of those through. Still, there are many reasons for optimism for 2021 and beyond, starting with the economy. Forecasters expect the US economy to expand about 5% this year. That's important because after all, we are still the world's largest economy by far. And also the US has, I believe, the best potential growth for hardwoods, in the years ahead, especially with the favorable home building and remodeling trends we're seeing. Plus, a major demographic shift we'll discuss in a minute will bring expanded opportunities this year and in the years ahead. Now, just as important as the highlighted forecast numbers for 2021 in red show, forecasters are calling for solid to strong GDP growth in leading export markets. This should bolster hardwood demand abroad, at least hopefully it will. There is another trend that I don't want to overstate, but which I do want to mention. The pandemic exposed US overdependence on foreign-made products, especially essential products like medicines and medical supplies. As a result, it does seem that consumer appreciation for products made in the USA is growing. We don't make prescription drugs or weapons for the military in our industry, things that might be deemed essential. So there are not likely to be mandates requiring domestic hardwood usage. Even so, US wood products manufacturers and hardwood suppliers can capitalize on this sentiment if it gains momentum and if we play our cards right. A minute ago, I alluded to an important demographic shift with the potential to lift domestic hardwood demand. Let me explain. And this, I hope will be highly encouraging to everyone. The US population consists of about 335 million people in 6 generations. For decades, baby boomers were the economic engine that drove demand for homes and for home furnishings. As they have aged, that's no longer the case. The next generation, Generation X, has slightly fewer people and less wealth than baby boomers. Ultimately, Generation X has not provided the level of economic energy as the baby boom generation. The next generation, the millennials, has 85.7 million people and 19% more than baby boomers. Their influence is already evident in a large increase in housing demand. Plus, they stand to inherit quite a bit of money in the years ahead. If they take a similar path as baby boomers, a high percentage will purchase single-family homes, and most will buy more than one house in their lifetime, with each subsequent house increasing in size and value. Single-family housing has a much greater influence on hardwood demand than multifamily housing, so this is very good news. The up-and-coming millennial generation will drive demand for homes, building products, and home furnishings, a higher level of demand than seen in the last 20 years. Right behind the millennials is Generation Z, which has almost as many people. As the millennial generation reaches its home buying peak, much of Generation Z will be also at prime age for home buying. The overlap between these two generations should elevate demands for homes and home furnishings for an extended period of time. To put it another way, we are at the early stages of an era when 169 million people in the US will need to buy homes and home furnishings. Demand for hardwoods and hardwood products could grow substantially as a result. But I must stress, only if consumers, as well as the people who determine the styles and products consumers are offered, only if they choose hardwoods. How can we get them to choose hardwoods? Well, that is easy. Promotion. It's easy to say it, not so easy to do it. This morning, we received an update on the Real American Hardwood Coalition activities, which I found very encouraging. As I hope I've demonstrated in some of the later slides, it appears that the future will present some great opportunities for hardwoods, especially in the United States. If we want our industry and our individual companies to capitalize on these opportunities, we need to get behind promotion. We need to get behind this effort. That concludes my presentation. Thank you for your attention, and I'm very happy to answer any questions y'all might have.
Andy, thank you so much for your presentation. I thought it was very good. I'm not seeing any questions coming through yet in the question box or the chat function, but folks, we've got a few minutes if somebody's got a question for Andy. In the meantime there, Andy, I was glad to see that you had the one slide in there showing that even though the housing and a lot of those other things, were going up over the last several years, that the grade hardwood grade lumber markets have not been going up at that same pace. And I think that feeds right into how you ended this report, and what we heard earlier today from the Real American Hardwood Coalition is that we have lost an awful lot of our market share to these other products, and that it's that promotion of our products. It's the only way we're going to get a lot of that back. So that slide tied right into what we heard earlier today. So I appreciate that. Again, if anybody's got a question, we'll hold this open for another minute. Okay, so we have one coming in here. Well, it's not a question, but Rick Meyer, I assume from FRA, is saying, great presentation, Andy.
Thanks, Rick.
Yeah, we agree. It's very, very good presentation. Okay, well, not seeing any other questions. Andy, I appreciate your spending time with us today and updating us on this trends and statistics here of the hardwood markets and stuff.
Sure thing.
Oh, wait a minute, got a couple things coming in here.
Nope.
I'll let go of you yet. So Rob McCarthy asks, production constraints will last for how long?
Well, Rob, that's a very good question. I think, obviously some of the constraints have to do with social distancing requirements that are kind of hindering productivity at mills. Obviously, those will come to an end at some point and are already starting to probably be eased more and more. So that'll help. Capital constraints hopefully will also ease up a little bit. Not necessarily because banks will become more forthcoming with money, but because, frankly, folks are making more money than they were making before. I also would say that, once it became clear that this was not going to be the end of the world, mills that stopped buying timber and stopped making arrangements to, kind of going forward, they started doing that again. But landowners, of course, have still been rather hesitant to sell. And in some areas, as we know, like in Wisconsin's a good example, residuals markets have not been good. So if you don't have more outlets for the pulpwood, then it's not likely that you're going to want to do a lot of logging. So some of those constraints will remain, but if, and we do have fewer loggers than in the past, but I think we've seen, even with that situation, we are still able to oversupply as an industry. I think even today, it's just taken us a little bit longer this time because of everything that's happened and the how shaken the supply chain was. With COVID coming right on the heels of course, a big decline in Chinese demand. So it's taken longer for that to come back than it has in the past. But, we feel like we're not much into making predictions here, but from everything I can tell and talking to people and from what I can see, it's going to be well towards the end of the year, may not even be till next year until we see those constraints lifted enough to bring supply back in terms of equilibrium with demand.
Okay, thank you for that, Andy. I got a few more questions coming in for you. So
right.
my predecessor, John Dorka, we have the question, the expectation is that the new administration will push for higher taxes and more regulations. What is your anticipation of the impact on the industry?
Oh gosh. All right, I got to be careful because I'm a very political person and I don't want to say anything out of line here. But clearly, if we have higher taxes on what they consider to be wealthy people, that often includes individual business owners. So that's obviously not going to have a positive effect. My feeling is that and I think also regulations are something we need to be keeping our eye on, and hopefully we've got our advocates in DC are able to do something to maybe hold back the tide of what may be some increased regulations that it could add costs and so forth. I still feel like the housing and remodeling sectors are going to provide such opportunities, not for booming demand necessarily, but for us to see increased demand, and so that some of the other things that might happen policy-wise hopefully won't be as big of an impact on the overall picture. if that makes sense.
Good. Thanks, Andy. Got another one here from Dale Egbert asking, how do you think the new Green Deal will impact the hardwood lumber industry should it be enacted? Going to
Oh
these
my gosh.
political questions. Yeah.
Yeah. I'll put it to you this way: if the new Green Deal gets enacted, I just can't find anything strong enough to say how bad I think that will be for our country. It's lunacy. But I mean, I think it would turn a whole lot of things upside down. Maybe not overnight, because I would assume it wouldn't be implemented immediately. But certainly, I think again, if we have promotion. If we're able to promote and able to actually reach the consumer and everything that we're hoping to through the coalition, we could have a net positive because, of course, we're environmentally friendly. We're basically carbon neutral. We compare well to other building materials, so you would think that we would benefit. But of course, that's only true if we can get the message out. And I think, if that thing does pass, I guess I haven't even been willing to admit in my head it's possible. But if it does pass, I think in the short term, because we haven't reached that critical mass with the public, with our message, I think it would be very harmful because people, a lot of people still consider wood to be not environmentally friendly. And until we can convince them otherwise, then that could affect business. But let's hope that that doesn't happen.
Thanks for that one. And we got a couple more here. We got just enough time to wrap up. From Rob McCarthy, are we seeing any change in log exports to China since Russia shut down roundwood shipments earlier this year?
We don't have data yet, Rob, but we certainly are seeing higher demand. Now, the numbers, when we actually get the numbers from USDA, we may not actually see that show up in the numbers because, for example, we know that log demand for several species rose towards the end of last year for China and other markets, but especially China. And China did perform better. I think there was a small net gain in log exports to China last year compared to like a 22% decline to all the other markets. But we may not see that in the numbers simply because the logs aren't available. But yes, we are seeing an increase. I'm not sure if it's tied in with the Russian situation or not. It probably is somewhat related to that, but I think it's just more so that the Chinese economy is improving, consumer demand is improving, and they need more materials.
Thanks, Andy. One last one here from Charles McClure. Was the shift to Vietnam and Malaysia because of tariffs on China?
Absolutely. I mean, manufacturing was moving in the direction of Vietnam, especially even before that, because their costs are lower than China. But you saw the tariffs go into effect, and you saw Chinese shipments drop by something like 90 to 95%, and then immediately explosive growth from these other two markets. So, and there's several other ones I didn't show in there that are also have also seen huge growth. So yeah, it was tariff related. It's also possible, and I think I probably may have said this in the past, it's also possible that some of those shipments that are showing coming from Vietnam and Malaysia are not coming from Vietnam and Malaysia, or only technically are. They're still being made in China, but somehow they're trying to circumvent the duties and so forth. So yeah, it's totally tariff and duty related.
Okay. Thanks, Andy. I don't see any more questions coming in. We're right at the end of our time. So, Andy, I really appreciate it. Another great presentation. And folks, don't forget as we go on through the afternoon to ask those questions, because we got the professionals here today to answer them like Andy. So appreciate that.
Thanks, Brad.
Andy, thanks for joining us, Andy. I appreciate it.
Absolutely. Thank you for having me.
Yep. Okay, folks, I think we'll recognize our sponsors here for 1 minute. On our little video that we have, and then we'll be back at 2:10, which is really only about a minute away for a detailed account from the